Okay, we're all very, very lucky to be present at this afternoon's lecture. I know I feel very privileged. I'm sure you do too. Please welcome Mr. Tony Visconti.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for taking the time to be with us today. I just felt like maybe to get us in the mood, maybe we could start with a record.
Well, would you like a record that we want to analyze, or just a record?
Whichever you like. Maybe you could play a record and tell us what you did to it afterwards.
All right. Well, this is one of the most famous records I'm known for, and you might have heard it. It's in every supermarket, every Macy's. Here we go. Thanks. Okay, I recorded that in 1971 at Wally Heider's studio in Los Angeles. No click tracks were used or computers because they weren't invented yet. And the T-Rex had two hits in the UK, and my boss back in the UK, I was in America at the time visiting my mother and father. My boss in the UK said, we need an album. We have the current song in the charts is #1. It's been #1 for 3 weeks. And we had no album in the can, so I literally had to follow T-Rex across America and record them when I could. So we did about 3 or 4 tracks in Manhattan, and we did about 2 tracks in Wally Heider's. And this song we just learned the night before in a hotel room. Mark had written it, and the band heard it. The drummer heard it for the first time the night before. Then the next day we went to the backing singer's house, which is Flo and Eddie from the Frank Zappa group, who they were in a previous incarnation. They were the Turtles, who sang "Happy Together." I mean, these are very historical recordings. You might not even be aware of them. But so anyway, we learned, the rest of the band, myself, we all jammed on this song at a swimming pool in Los Angeles. So I mean, you can't get more rock and roll than this. We went in that night to Wally Heider's and recorded the backing track. And Flo, well, I've got a photo of that, but I'll come around to it later. And Flo and Eddie sang backups that night. And all the strings, the saxophone, the piano, that was added when the group came back to London. And we went to a studio called Trident Studios, which is a real hallmark studio, where the Queen made their, not the Queen, the Queen lives in Buckingham Palace. Queen made their records. Everyone made their records there, the Beatles, everybody. And we didn't have any strings. You hear there's strings on that record, and we didn't have strings written, but we did have strings on the 2 previous singles. So Mark and I got very superstitious, and at the last minute, we had a string section in the studio playing 2 other songs. And all I could do on the spur of the moment was just tell them the entire section to play G, A, and E on the chorus. And I'm telling you, it made all the difference in the world. And that was a slam and hit record in the United States and the UK and all over Europe and all that. So that was the first time I really felt that I did something worthwhile, that kind of made everybody happy. It had artistic integrity, and it made a lot of money.
And how would you describe your job? How would you describe your job on that record, and how would you describe your job in general?
Well, I guess I'm an old school producer, which defines me as the person in charge of everything. The record label expected me to organize the studio time, get all the players in, rehearse the band, do pre-production. And then I work very close with the band, though. I mean, I do what the label tells me to do, but I work with the band because I'm a fellow musician, and I know that musicians have dreams and they want to get their stuff down on tape, and that is not an easy thing. When you have like a lot of people, you have to get everybody on the team on the same page. So I'm responsible for everything. But I think a record producer should know on some level, at a high level actually, all the jobs. Like, I'm also an engineer. I trained in engineering. I trained in classical composition. I know how, I used to dissect Beethoven's symphonies and Mozart string quartets to figure out how they were done. That was part of my musical training. And ultimately, from those days, from T-Rex days onwards, I started to mix my own records too, because I don't know, the group and I, we knew what we wanted, and then why get a third party in who, just came in from lunch and said, okay, what have we got here, So I wanted to always make my recordings more sympathetic to the artist's needs and desires. So I've been a mixer since that year, 1971.
So with that in mind, do you think it's more important to have a knowledge of music and arrangement, or a knowledge of the technical and engineering in order to be a record producer like yourself, or is it essential to have both?
You don't have to, but I felt I did. I felt really, if I didn't know what I was talking about, I think the other person could smell a liar or a person who was just winging it. And, I think you speak to an engineer who's doing it for, say, 15, 20 years, and you say, can you make that guitar more twangy or beef it up and stuff like that? It's like everyone's definition of beef is different, and everyone's definition of twang is different. But if you say specifically, I want to boost at 3.5 kilohertz, and I want it to be wide or narrow, or I just want to focus in on the plectrum, the hitting the strings, and so, like, when you start to, it helps to talk a little bit technical to an engineer. For a start, you'll get respect, and so the engineer can't pull any wool over your eyes either. So, I made it my purpose to learn that job, and the job of engineering. So when I had my own studio, I did engineer. But now that I don't have a big studio with big rooms and all that, I like to hire an engineer to do my work for me on the session. I don't want to learn somebody's studio in one day. I don't want to walk into a studio cold and learn how it works. So I'll use a freelance, but I still mix my own stuff. So I thought it was very important to know the jobs. Of course, when I work with, when I write an arrangement, it helps a lot to put notes in front of musicians who can read notes. I mean, I know a lot of people nowadays use say a violinist and a cellist to play all the parts, and you get some really clever young people who can make up parts on the spot and all that. But basically, you're just sitting back and watching other people do their thing and all that. And if you have something in mind, it's much easier to convey it if you are a musician yourself. Don't necessarily have to read and write music, but if you could sit down and play a part to another musician, play it on a guitar or piano, sing it, all that helps. So I think you should get as much training as you can. It'll make your work easier, and you'll have a longer career as a result.
And clearly you've played bass on some very famous records, and you've done some amazing string arranging. Where is that line between producing, arranging, and writing? When do you become a writer on a record?
Well, for me, there's no line. But it depends who I'm working with. If it's someone like David Bowie, he really appreciates musicianship and other people, and he'll let other people shine, which is one of his gifts. And he'll be there. He'll control it. Like, if it's not going in a way that he likes, he'll control it. But he'll let me do a lot of crazy stuff, and he likes me to bring that out in other people too as a producer. Whereas some people have very, very firm guidelines. They want to sound exactly one way, and this way you can't deviate it. There is a sound that's associated with them, and they want you to, like, improve it a little bit, but not change it completely. So I'll do less interference. I'll do less with that. What I will do is, for instance, I work with Morrissey as a singer. And he said, all I want you to tell me, when it was time for his vocals, he said, all I want you to tell me is to sing louder or quieter. I said, all right, fine. We'll start out from that bass. And as that was just for the vocals. He let me have my way with the band. I got the band to jump through hoops. But, after he gained confidence in me, after a few days, I was able to give him a little more coaching than that. But if that's all he wanted from me, I was perfectly happy with that. I'm not going to make him, I'm not going to dictate to a person who doesn't want to be dictated to.
And maybe you could talk to us a little bit about being the director when it comes to vocalists in particular, and working with stars and vocalists that might be difficult or might be a dream to work with, like you said David was. How do you impose your view in the studio without being a dictator?
All right, this thing about my view is, first of all, I take on the artist's view. I have a view. My view is that it all goes down well, and it sounds fantastic. That's my view. with a person like Morrissey or Bowie or anyone really, they come in with a passion. You know, they've written the music. This is in the case of that they've written. Most people I work with do write their own music. And they tell me what they want. And I tell them if ways that I think we could improve that idea, or I elaborate. You know, I work with a set of ideas. You can't go in with a complete blank canvas. You have to have focus from even before you step in the studio. You have to say what you expect to how the record turns out. So you say, I want the record to sound like this. I want it to have these elements. That's what you go for. You don't go for the kitchen sink. I don't believe in the kitchen sink style of recording. In fact, I believe in doing the most with the least amount of instruments. That's arranging, you know. With the exception to the rule might be Phil Spector, who did throw the kitchen sink in, but he did it well, didn't he?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, well, back down to singers. You know, like I know, for instance. So some singers don't have an operatic voice, and I'm not going to try to get them to go like, ah, you know, like high notes and all that. But I work within what a singer does have. I find immediately, within an hour or two, or even hopefully before the project starts, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And you'd be surprised if a person doesn't have a great voice, there's something they have. There's some reason why they were signed. There's something, you know. And you find that personality in their voice, and that's the thing you work on. You don't tell them, you know, they're a terrible singer if they can't hit exceptionally high notes, or they sing out of tune a lot. Out of tune you could control, actually, just by making a singer relaxed. I think it's usually nerves and tightening of the neck that makes a singer sing out of tune. So you have to, I have to calm things down, and that's how I get my best results.
We were lucky enough to have a lecture from Mr. Trevor Horn last week, and when someone challenged him and said, "How do you avoid lying to a vocalist?" He simply replied, "What are you talking about? I always lie." I mean, what's your approach with a vocalist? I mean, how do you get the best out of a performance when you feel that you're not getting it?
Well, I just waited. I wait till the nerves die down. I wait it out. You know, I just go through, like, you could always take a few takes and just to warm them up. And usually, I don't know, I can't really describe how I do it. I just have a good relationship with people. I kind of meld with them, you know. I don't know how you do that, except being sympathetic to someone's feelings. Vocalists have feelings, you know. I will push a vocalist, however, if they kind of give me a wimpy performance and it's a big, powerful song. They wrote it. And I'll say, why aren't you singing it the way you wrote it, you know? But I won't say it like so directly.
How many takes do you give them? Are you kind of the person that allows people to record infinitely, or do you limit it to a number of takes?
I like to limit it because it's unfair. Every vocalist wants some direction. That's why I'm there. That's why they hire me. They don't hire me to comp their vocals, like, you know, to just say record 30, 40, 50 vocals, and then you go home and I'll make I'll tune everything. And I'm not that school. I can do that, but I don't like to do that. I would rather work with a singer and have a great relationship with them, give them feedback, tell them they could sing the third verse over again, maybe change the melody, you know, improvise on the melody a bit. All that stuff is coaching, and that's what I've gained from years of experience. You know, like I've asked people to go and rewrite their choruses. You know, and that's something you have to have balls to do that, and you have to say it in a nice way, you know, because the chorus might go nowhere. But I don't know. I feel that if I don't say things like that, the buck stops with me. If I don't say things like that, nobody's going to say it, and then you'll be like riding on a crest of bullshit, you know. If nobody says, you know. So they hire me as a producer. I've got to call the shots on that level. That it's not coming off well. It's not honest. You're not feeling it. I have to say things like that. And I know it's a hard thing to do, very hard thing to do.
And talking of that, I mean, are you quite strict about having to have ideas well rehearsed and ready when you walk into the studio, so it's a question of performing them? Or are you more from the school of working things out once you're in the studio environment?
Well, if we've got a decent budget, I like to do about 2 or 3 days of pre-production. Just go over every song a few times. And before that, I will have notes, and I will make suggestions, and we'll try them out in pre-production. But I love to leave about 50% of the production ideas I love to leave them until we get into the studio and start working, because the environment in the studio is much different from a rehearsal studio where everybody's just playing loud and you might record the rehearsal on some little 2-track recorder. In the studio, everything's under a microscope. Suddenly, for the first time, you hear everything clearly and big, and you could zoom in on detail. And, I'm not talking about a computer, I'm talking about with your ears. You just focus in. I mean, I've been in situations with 2 guitarists where one guitarist did not know that the other guitarist was playing a different chord at a certain point, because they play so loud on stage and all that. In the studio, they start working out. They start adjusting to each other and understanding things like that. So, I like to leave about 50% of all those decisions to do it in the moment in the studio.
It's interesting to talk about making decisions as well, almost destructive decisions on the way in the process of recording, because the majority, I would say, of the participants involved in the academy have experience of working alone within a computer, and that is in many ways the modern term producer. But in the live environment, in your environment, how important is the element of performance and the interaction between live musicians and sort of making decisions along the way of what to keep and what to leave for good?
Well, I have to go on for about 2 minutes about that. I have to set that one up. It's not going to take very long. I produced a song by David Bowie called Heroes. Are you familiar with that? They use it for every heroic event, although it's a song about alcoholics. But we'll see if everyone loves heroes, So I produced that, and we did it on 24 tracks in Hansa Studios. And we had, it's a super production. You'll hear backing vocals and all kinds of instruments on it. We had 1 track left for the vocal. And talk about destructive recording. So he'd do a vocal, and we'd listen to it, and he'd say, I think I've got one better. And I'd say, well, we can't keep that take. It was before digital recording. So he'd pull his socks up, he'd take a deep breath, and he'd go and do a better take than the one he did before. And that was it. It was gone. The vocal was gone. The previous vocal was gone. And we kept doing that. And then, like having experience in the studio, you had to know when to say, I think we've got the take. There's no way of going back to take 5 or take 2. They were gone. They were, evaporated. I did a lot of records that way. That's when you work as a team, as a producer, a coach, a singer, an artist, and everybody's on the same page, and everyone is just hyped up with adrenaline. This is such a good experience. I find this almost completely lacking in today's recording styles. So, and I do lecture students at NYU in New York, and I've been like scratching my head. How do we do this? Because we all know that we have playlists. We all know that we could save everything that's recorded now. And even, the first groan on day 1 to the last scream on day 7, we can save all those things. What I think is that what we did by having the destructive recording is we knew that this was going to be an eternal recording. It was going to outlive us. This recording we were making is going to become tomorrow's history. Knowing that, you should really pump up your adrenaline, knowing that. It's just not about doing takes, and comping. There's no passion in that. There's no energy in that. So what I ask my NYU students is to think about that when they go in front of a mic. Say, the performance I'm about to do is going to outlive me. I want people 50 years from now to hear what I'm singing. If it's no good, it's going to be rubbish. It's going to be thrown away. If it's great, people 50 years from now will hear my voice singing this song. So it's like almost a mantra or something. You have to like really hype yourself up to get that thing we used to get with destructive recording. So there, I said my 2 minutes.
Cool. Can we listen to that vocal take? I think
you want to hear Heroes?
Yeah.
Well, the other, do you have it on there?
Yeah, I do.
Let me just say one thing. We worked in Hansa, which was a studio where you were recorded a symphony orchestra. You could have about 150 pieces in this room. And here was David Bowie standing in this enormous auditorium. And every time he sang, he could sing very loud, and his voice was just echoing off the walls and the ceiling and everything. And I said, could you give me half an hour? I want to set up 2 microphones. So I set up a U47, Neumann U47 in front of him, And then about 15, 20 feet away, I set up something like a 67, and then way down at the end of the hall, I set up another microphone, another condenser microphone. Now, I only had one track left, right? So I couldn't record these microphones on separate tracks. What I did was I put a gate on microphone 2 and another gate on microphone 3. So when he sang like this, those microphones wouldn't open up. You wouldn't hear the ambience in the room. When he sang like this, the middle microphone would open up. And when he went, ah! That's called Bowie histrionics. All 3 microphones would open up. And the reverb you hear on this recording is only that room. And God bless him, he lets Tony do his thing. So I did my thing, he did his thing, and this is the resulting, just one more thing. You'll hear some backing vocalists, and they were done by 2 people only. One person has a British accent, and the other has a Brooklyn accent, so you could figure out who's singing what. I'm the Brooklyn guy. Room and all. Isn't that exciting? You do things like that, it's like, wow, I'm glad I'm alive today.
So as you say, we heard a British voice and we heard a Brooklyn voice, originally from Brooklyn, New York, but you'd go on to become a sort of honorary Londoner at one point in your life. Do you want to tell us about the transition from your sort of early days in New York and then making the move over to the UK?
Right, well in New York, I always wanted to be in the record business, but it's probably the toughest city to break into. And I did some forays into, I did some session work as a musician. I never really produced in New York. And I met I was a songwriter, and I met my future boss by the water cooler in my publisher's office. And he said, hello. And I said, you're English. And he said, yes. And I said, well, you're the first English person I ever met, you know. So he said, well, what do you do here? And I said, I'm the house record producer. I'm just doing demos for my publisher. And he said, well, you're my American cousin. I record for this company in the UK. I'm the house producer in the UK. So his name was Denny Cordell. And he said, shall I play you something? And I said, of course. And we found a room with a turntable, and he put an acetate on of Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale. He had just produced it. It wasn't even released yet. And I went, it just blew my mind that something so soulful and beautiful could come out of the UK, you know, which is, I was used to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. This was fantastic. So I helped him out that day with a recording session. He came totally unprepared, and he recorded cats like Clark Terry on trumpet, and you know, and I said, I got to see the session. I've got to see the music. And he said, I have no music. I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to play the demo, and they're just going to like come up with an arrangement. I said, this is New York, Denny. You'll get charged triple for that, you know. So I listened to his demo, and I wrote, it already had horns on it, trumpets on it, and I wrote out the parts very quickly, wrote out the chord changes, and I wrote out where the drums would have to stop and where they would continue again. And this is for about 8 pieces. He hired 8 top New York session players, the top guys, who I only read about. I had never met them. So we run down the street, we Xeroxed this one sheet of music, ran down the street, put it in front of Clark Terry, great trumpet player. And they looked it over, and they did a few run-throughs, and we got like take 3, it was done. It was done in 3 takes. I said, Denny, by the way, how do you do this in the UK? I mean, how do you do it? Like, you expect it to happen. And he says, well, everybody kind of saunters into the room. We roll a spliff. We listen to the music. I said, no, not New York in the 60s, you know. So like he expected those people to hang out like 8 to 10 hours to do this one song. So anyway, he looks at me with great admiration in his eyes, and he said, would you fancy working with me in the UK, in London? And I said, oh my God, you know, I pinched myself because like at that time, the pop music in New York and America basically was very bland, and the only real good stuff was coming out of the UK, like the Beatles, the Stones, and all that. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I had to beg my boss to let me go to learn how the Brits do it. And I was only going to stay for 6 months. And when I arrived, I was just working night and day, like on his sessions. He would leave me with Procol Harum while they were making their album. He'd go off and produce somebody else. And I didn't even have that much experience, but I couldn't let this man down. He believed in me so much that I just did production 101. I mean, on the spot, and I got laughed at, ridiculed. You know, also the British have, you know, they take the piss. Where I came from in Brooklyn, that was a fighting word. Somebody takes a piss with a Brooklyn guy, you punch him. So I mean, I didn't understand the culture, but I made it through the first week. Within the first week, I had met like I didn't meet him, but I saw Jimi Hendrix jam in a nightclub like 3 feet from me. He just got up on the stage in the dark, picked up a guitar, and he jammed. You know, and this was like every day I had to pinch myself that this was really, really happening. I heard the white label of pressing of Sgt. Pepper's 3 months before it was released. This guy came to Denny's apartment at midnight and took the white label out from under his coat. We rolled down the shades and all that, made a huge joint, and listened to the Beatles record 3 months before it came out. I mean, this was all happened in the first week. So the six months was up, and I stayed 22 years. I didn't want to go home.
And so what year was it that you moved to London?
This would be 67.
67, okay.
I just turned 22, and yeah, I stayed till 89.
And you mentioned the Beatles a couple of times. You know, clearly you had a break and a sort of and a mentor production-wise, but did you have a production hero before? I can imagine the work of George Martin being quite influential.
Well, yeah, George Martin was my hero, and I'll tell you why. Because I played in high school in a symphony orchestra. I played jazz. I played double bass, and I had some friends. We used to go to Greenwich Village and jam, you know. And I was a real steaming bass player too. I could play very fast and very hard. And I didn't know what I was. I played rock and roll on like a church dance. I'd pick up a guitar and play Chuck Berry stuff and all that. And I didn't know what I was. I had to like kind of said, what should I be? Should I be a jazz guy? Should I be classical? Should I, you know, I took lessons on the bass and I could play. I think I played Schubert's First Symphony in the bass section. And then when I heard George Martin and the Beatles, I said, that's what I am. I'm George Martin, only I'm a kid from Brooklyn. That's the only difference, you know. So I have to work with people who need all these services, you know. They need an arranger, they need an engineer, they need a bass player, they need a, you know, a backup singer, a tambourine player. I'm all those people. So I kind of found myself by going to the UK. And, you know, one of the greatest moments of my life was to actually meet George Martin. And then I met and worked with almost every Beatle. I worked with 3 Beatles except for John Lennon. And with John Lennon, I spent the most memorable night of my life. But, you know...
Can you tell us about it?
Sure, it's a very funny story, but it involves a lot of drug talk. I don't know if you guys want to hear it. I don't know if you're ready for the big time. No, I do not condone the use of drugs, but I've been straight edge now for 12 years. But I'll tell you this one very funny story. We're making Young Americans, and Bowie's very nervous. He phoned me up and he said, Lennon is coming to my room tonight, my suite. And I wish you would be there because I'm very, very nervous. I want you to buffer our meeting. That's the exact word he used. Could you buffer our meeting? Like an aspirin. So I arrive and I knock on the door and there's a lot of shuffling behind the door. And finally they said, who is it? And I said, it's Tony. And they thought I was the police because when I found out why, when I went in, there was a huge mountain of cocaine on the coffee table. I mean, this is the Himalayas. This is a peak in the Andes, right? This is a lot of damn cocaine, you know. So they're all chipping away and all that. And like if the police did raid, that would have been something you would have read about. You know, that would be a very, very big bust. So Bowie is very shy. He's still not talking to Lennon. He's sketching on a pad. He's avoiding eye contact with Lennon. And I said, I can't believe my luck. I've got John Lennon all to myself. So, what's the first chord on a Hard Day's Night? Could you tell me the thing? You know, that was like question one. I said, no, first of all, I said, do you mind if I ask you some questions? He said, no, go ahead, you know. So I asked him about 100 questions. And we got on really, really great and you know, chipping away at the mountain of cocaine, and the cognac was free-flowing and all that. That was the major drugs that fuel rock and roll. Anyone who tells you they didn't do this is a complete liar. But it was a 70s kind of thing, you know. So finally, John says, "Hey, David, do you have another one of those pads?" And David ripped it in half. And then John Lennon, of course, is a great artist himself. So this was amazing to see the two of them sketching each other. They were drawing sketches of each other and then ripping a page off and doing another sketch and all that. And this went on, you know, until about 10 a.m. Like it kind of ended kind of, what's the meaning of life, that kind of a talk. And we were all like, oh, I just want to go to bed. You know, I drank too much. I had too much Coke and all that. So that was like one of the best nights I ever had. I mean, I can't, this is 10 hours of conversation, you know, we had. I can't get into every detail, but it was a lot of fun. And he was a very open man. He was a very good man, you know, and you know, he didn't have to put on any airs. This guy, you know, one of the biggest stars that ever lived, and he could have been a real asshole. But
so clearly, the Beatles are huge influence. I mean, what was it about George Martin's production that unlocked the door for you in your mind that said, "I can do that. I can be a record producer, and I want to do what he does"?
Two records. I mean, the Beatles up until Revolver pretty much made pop songs, but then on Revolver they made songs that just took you into an inner world, you know, like they were using LSD, acid, and they made no, you know, they didn't hide that fact. And in fact, the artwork kind of, if you look at the cover of Revolver, it says like, take drugs, drop acid, listen to me on acid. So I did. And my God, it was like, you know, they call it Revolver, the record. So when it got to, you know, records used to have two sides. Oh, you know that, the vinyls. So I got to the second side, and John Lennon would chant, in the beginning, and I was on acid, so I would just flip it over and play the beginning. And I realized I had done that about 50 times until I came down in the morning. I said, I better stop listening to this damn record, you know. And of course, I was like hallucinating like mad. Oh boy, those days were great, weren't they? So anyway, this album, when a Revolver, I said, there's something going on besides the four Beatles. There's somebody else, and that was George Martin. And he was the one who was translating. I mean, they must have been effed up in the studio. They must have really been crazy. And somebody kept it all together, and that was George Martin. And also when you heard a song like, so it was kind of that album and a single called Strawberry Fields Forever, which I said, again, that just can't be the Beatles. Somebody else is involved. And also Eleanor Rigby. It was probably one of the most beautiful string arrangements ever written, and that's all George Martin. You know, that's all down to him.
Phones off, please. That would be great.
How did they know I was here?
Can we listen to it? Do you want to listen to a little bit of Eleanor Rigby?
Eleanor Rigby,
maybe just a snippet
you must
to
have
kind
heard
of.
all these, but
of course, but you know, when you listen with different ears and you're listening to the arrangement, it's good to hear it.
Respect.
Respect. So, I mean, apart of course from the amazing songwriting of Lennon and McCartney, you know, when you analyse that record or you analysed it with your early producer head on, which part of that is the Beatles and which part of that is George Martin?
Well, you know, the Beatles are most likely responsible for their vocal arrangement, and they were blessed with 4 lead singers in the group. You rarely find that nowadays, but the arrangement is definitely, that's the George Martin side. That's the obvious, this is the most obvious example of who the Beatles are, you know. And of course the great song was written by Paul McCartney on I believe a piano. He's very versatile. I've worked with him. He's extremely versatile. Never makes a mistake. That's sickening. He never makes a mistake. I did a session with him. He played for 3 hours and never made a mistake. It just got better and better. But anyway, that's an example of how I see a producer and a group working, and that was the model. That's the way I modeled my own career.
So I'm still laughing about the John Lennon story. Okay, so back to you as a producer. Just let's go straight into being in London and meeting arguably the two most important connections of your musical journey, Mark Bolan and David Bowie. Which came first, and do you want to tell us about that exciting period in your life as a young record producer?
Sure. Mark Bolan came first only by about a month. My boss said to me, Denny Cordell, I worked with him, I assisted him on his productions, and I started mixing his productions. I mixed Joe Cocker's A Little Help from My Friends, and most of that album, I was the mixer on that. And I really wasn't mixing for very long. I just, there's a certain advantage of being young and from another city. And so he said, now you have to find a group of your own. And I noticed every week in the London Underground, the Time Out used to be an underground newspaper. It was like 4 sheets of paper. And weekly there was a UFO club every Wednesday night. And in the UFO club on Tottenham Court Road in London, by the way, was a group called Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I said, I'm going to check this group out, because who would name themselves Tyrannosaurus Rex? That's such a, everybody was like Joe and the Mighty Heap or something. I don't know. There was like very common names, but Tyrannosaurus Rex was very unusual. And I went down this was the day I was told to find a band of my own. So I go down the steps of UFO Club, and I hear the music coming up the stairwell. And I went, I love this already. I haven't even seen them, and I love it. It was just acoustic guitar and clay bongo drums. And Mark was singing. I don't know if you remember Mark's voice, but he had a whoa, he had a like warble in his voice. And he overpronounced his words so much, I actually thought he was singing in French. I didn't even think it was English. It sounded very French in a way. And he was beautiful, and I thought the club was empty because I didn't hear people screaming or anything. There were about 200 kids they were just quiet as a mouse, listening to every nuance of his voice. And I said, I came to England to find the next Beatles, and instead I found this band, this little folk duo. And one thing I did realize, even though he was using an acoustic guitar and bongo drums, they were playing rock and roll. And later on, Mark explained to me, I always wanted to play rock and roll, but this is all I could afford. I could only afford a 12-quid guitar. And Steve used to get all his instruments. He would find them Steve Peregrine Took, his partner, would find instruments on the street or in, Portobello Road, or just in, trash bins and all that. So it was a great experience to find them. They came the next day to my offices and with Danny, and they played to Danny, and he said, okay, I like them. We'll take them on as our token underground group. We had to have one of everything. So this was our token, which I didn't see the philosophy in that at all, but I thought they were more than a token underground group. I thought Mark Bolan was a star. It was so obvious he was a star. So we made about 3 or 4 albums as Tyrannosaurus Rex, and I think on the 2nd or 3rd album, they were all hits, but minor hits, but it brought in enough money to warrant another time in the studio, another album. And the electric guitar started to appear, especially on an album called Unicorn. And you can hear the rock sound of Tyrannosaurus Rex emerging. The only thing was that the name was too difficult for DJs to pronounce. Can you imagine? How DJs can be. And they couldn't pronounce Tyrannosaurus Rex. So everyone lays claim to, no, I didn't intend. No, you're smart. So everyone lays claim to the fact that I changed it to T-Rex. No, I changed it to T-Rex, and we all did in a way. I mean, I couldn't write Tyrannosaurus Rex in my diary every day, so I would abbreviate it. But when we changed the name to T-Rex and we made a record called Ride a White Swan, we were on the map. We had a hit. It wasn't so easy with Bowie. So a month after I met Mark Bolan, my other boss, I had 2 bosses. My other boss, David Platz, said, you seem to be good with the stranger sort of artist. I don't know how he put it, odd artist. And he said, he played me a record by David Bowie, and it was his first record, I think called A Man of Music. And every track sounded completely different. It was like Anthony Newley, like stage Broadway musicals, British musicals. Then he would have a folk tune, then a brass band song and all that. And I said, you're right, he's odd. He's all over the map, in fact. And he said, would you like to meet him? And I said, yes, I would. Because the only thing I really heard on that album was his magnificent voice. Even at 19, he had one of the greatest, most powerful voices I've ever heard. So I met him, he was in the next room. It was all a setup. I met him in the next room, and we got on like a house on fire. We just couldn't stop talking. We had similar interests in, like, we both loved Jerry Mulligan. We both loved Little Richard. We both loved Chuck Berry. And then weird things like a spoken word artist called Ken Nordine. You've got to look this guy up, Ken Nordine. It was like poetry and jazz, basically. And and the Fugs, the underground group from America called the Fugs, who used they were the first group to use cuss words, like the word that John Lennon said in their music. So instead of like getting down to music, we just spent the whole day together, talking and all that. We walked along King's Road. We saw a movie together, A Knife in the Water by Roman Polanski. I'll never forget it. And then we said goodbye to each other about 9 o'clock in the evening. And so I made a couple of years of disastrous demos with him, and he was hard to break. You know, it was really hard to break, and he still couldn't focus on one style. And in a way, that was when the world finally caught up to him. That was a good thing. But in the beginning, you know, we have to know if this guy's a rock and roller, if he's a folk singer, if he, you know, you have to be very specific in those days. Even now, you know. Well, I'm kind of all over the place. I got, you know, it won't do. People want to pigeonhole you immediately. It was so then, and it is so now. So, well, that's how I met the both of them.
I mean, if you look at the sort of the Berlin albums, which we'll get onto later, the sort of proof that he was able to go on and do everything on one record, you know, including instrumental music as well as hits.
Yeah.
But what was the layup record, the record where it all came together and gave him the stardom and the notoriety in order to be able to have the confidence to do that later down the line?
Well, it wasn't Space Oddity, because he wrote Space Oddity and then he never wrote another song like it. And it was actually released 3 times before DJs picked it up. And it was, I think, because of the moon. I think it was the first time an astronaut circled the moon, orbited the moon. And I said, "You're not going to write another song like that." And he didn't. He couldn't. And he didn't have an immediate hit after that. So we went on to make one of my favorite Bowie albums. We went in the studio, and I mean, it wasn't very, very important to have a hit single in those days, because it was already the album era had begun. You know, people were buying albums, and you had to have like all albums had a theme, you know, unlike today, you know, there was like something that ran through it. So he wrote this amazing album called The Man Who Sold the World. And that is one of my, as a bass player, that's one of my proudest moments. My bass is all over that album like a cheap suit, you know. And very high in the mix, I might add. But his music was great. So The Man Who Sold the World, of course, a lot of younger people think that Kurt Cobain wrote that song, because he had a famous single, an unplugged version of it. But it's an original Bowie song. And like on that record alone, I played 3 basses. I played a bowed bass, a plucked bass, and I double tracked it with I borrowed an 8-string bass from a music store, a Hogstrom, like a 12-string guitar. I had it for one day, and I managed to get it on that track. So if you listen to that track, you'll find the low end is very strange.
So would you say it was the chemistry between the two of you on that record that went on to forge such a sort of fruitful relationship, or was it Scary Monsters when it really gelled? Well,
eventually it did. Well, I didn't make we actually split up after that. We were frustrated. I couldn't help him, and you know, and also he went with a manager I completely hated. I despised the person he went with, and that was kind of the dividing line. I knew the man to be very dishonest, and I don't mind telling, and I shouldn't tell you his name, but it's be on the fucking YouTube. Anyway, it'll be, what was it? Oh yeah, so he went on to make Hunky Dory with the last engineer that I used, Ken Scott, which is a lovely album. Hunky Dory is one of my favorite Bowie albums that I didn't produce. I mean, it's just one great song after another. But it wasn't until we got together again on Diamond Dogs, and it was almost as if we never stopped communicating. Over the years, we'd have a few phone calls together, but Diamond Dogs sounds so much like The Man Who Sold the World in concept and wildness and craziness and surreal soundscapes and all that. So that's when we actually hooked up. In all, I've done about 10 Bowie albums. I've produced about 10 Bowie albums.
Wow. Well, it's probably relevant to listen to something from early on. Should we listen to something from The Man Who Sold the World, just to get a vibe of how that sounds?
Well, She Shook Me Cold. That's where we're doing our where's Eric Clapton's band? Cream. We're doing our Cream best. Thank you very much. It was the guitarist Mick Ronson, who we just started to work with. He got me to turn up my, first of all, to buy a Marshall. Was it a Marshall? I don't know. But it was a 200-watt head on my bass amp. And I was playing through 4 15-inch speakers, which was amazing in those days. And he said, just turn it up and play loud. And he was the kind of 11 guitars. He would turn everything up to 11. So Mick was really responsible for turning us into rock and rollers.
So if we fast forward a little bit to Scary Monsters, which is, I know, a record that you love.
I love it. I love it.
And why do you love it so much? And tell us about the memories of making that record.
Well, we had a standing joke. David and I said, every time we went into the studio, we said, this will be our Sgt. Pepper's, because, you know, Sgt. Pepper's was like the best Beatles album, or the most produced, or the trickiest and all that. And then after about 2 or 3 albums, we just made a joke, you know. We just say, okay, this will be our Sgt. Pepper's. And all. So we went in with Scary Monsters with the same joke, and you know what? It turned out really great, and the critics went nuts over it. It was, artists copied us. It started the New Romantic movement in London. It was just a breakthrough record on many, many levels, and it was kind of the 3 Berlin albums set that up. We learned a lot from those 3 Berlin albums, and we made the Scary Monsters. And I'm really, every track is just, I love it. You know, I can say that I got everything done. You know, I got everything done that was in our heads. I got it. So here's a song that we were going to throw out. We were on the last day, we were mixing actually, and he said, I can't finish this song. And I said, you're crazy. It's such a great backing track. I'll play you an earlier form of it, because he wrote it with his rhythm section, Carlos Alomar, George Murray, and Dennis Davis. They jammed on this song in Jamaica. So until he wrote the lyrics, I sent him home to write the lyrics. They called the song Jamaica. So the hook was like, Jamaica. So you obviously know this is another song. Here it is. Thank you. And that's more or less the way we ended up, except we later put on Robert Fripp, famous guitarist, on guitar on what came out to be Fashion eventually. And a synthesizer, a keyboard player who you really hear here and there. So believe it or not, this was going to be thrown out. This is because he couldn't come up with a lyric. And God knows where he got it, but he came back the next day with Fashion. So here's what it turned into. By the way, you'll hear like a whoop, 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 a backwards thing. The keyboard player we used had a sequencer, and believe it or not, that was his click track. I don't know why someone programmed this into be a click track, but it was such a great sound that we started the song with it. And you know, this is one of those decisions you make on the spot in the studio. You know, we didn't plan this. It was just right in front of us, and we used it. Thank you. That amazing guitar solo was Fripp on over 3 tracks, and during the mix we did many passes at this. You know, in those days, of course, we didn't have computers, but we would do passes and save the passes on. We'd record them to 1/4-inch tape, and if you look at the actual mix of Fashion, you'll find there's about 16 to 20 edits in it, because all those bits were done separately and then edited in. So the solo was, David sat at the 3 mute buttons on my console, and he would press it like Robert Fripp would play one thing, and he'd like slam down, and it would switch over to the next track that Robert Fripp played. So even the mixing, the selection of those 3 of those solos was random. It was just like, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. And you know, it's kind of what, it was quite modern for its time. And then I was always recording these passes on you know, the stereo mixtape. So I mean, there's a lot of adventure in that recording, a lot of seat of your pants stuff. And also, it's the first time, like, Dennis Davis asked for to play to a beatbox, so he got out a Roland, and you could actually hear it in there. And I thought it was unusual, because nobody could keep time like Dennis Davis. I have checked him out. Like, he'll start at 120 BPM and he'll end the song at 120 BPM. He's just so good. But he's a lovely, nutty guy, and he played to the beatbox. He just played, he played around it, and that's all his kick drum and all that. But and I reduced the beatbox to a very narrow mid-range frequency, so it's in there for the fake maracas and the fake claves and all that. But the bulk of it's Dennis Davis just having lots and lots of fun. And we recorded that song about 4 months before we did the final mix, so nobody knew what they were playing. Nobody knew it was going to be fashion. It was just a jam on Jamaica and a beatbox.
Now, the reason I thought it'd be cool to play those two examples is because Man Who Sold the World came out in 1970, right? Around there. And the record we just heard was from 1980. And in that sort of decade, obviously, there's a very important trilogy of records that Bowie fans around the world love and very influential, which we must talk about. But I think the way that we'll end up there is maybe by talking about the technology, which I know you love to geek out about gear and tech stuff. And in that decade alone, it changed quite dramatically. So I know you've got some photos. Maybe we could talk through the timeline of your studio life in London and the UK, because...
My first studio. That was the tape recorder on the left belonged to my father. I appropriated it to myself. He lost it, and it was mine. And then I got a stereo Panasonic tape recorder, which had this thing called cell sync, so you could record on, say, track 1, play it back, and record on track 2. So I went from this machine, I would record my basic track, and then I might have a drummer in my apartment and musicians, and we'd bounce that over to track 1 of the Panasonic, and then add a guitar as the bounce is going. So you had 2 or 3 musicians on the first pass, and on the second pass, I'm adding something live. Les Paul started that way until that clever man, invented the 8-track. So then on the second track, on track 2, I would add another instrument or a vocal, listening to the whole track on that, and then I would bounce both tracks back to this mono machine again, and go on until the recordings just crapped out and it was extremely lo-fi. But I try to reach the point just before it came lo-fi. So it was the demos that I made on these 2 machines got me my publishing deal and got me eventually. I became a record producer because of this setup. This is a long time ago, and this little thing that you could see here. It's a 3 input mixer my friend built. There's just 3 guitar jacks stuck in there, and it was a passive mixer. But it worked because I would put the 2 tracks of this machine into that mixer, and then a third track would be a microphone, and I'd bounce all that back to that machine. So that's how I started out, humble beginnings. One incredible thing was my friend Bruce, who lived around the corner, took me to Atlantic Records and showed me, this is where they made those great, some of the, Aretha records. That's the Atlantic Records console. It's just 3 meters. They used to record directly to tape. In those days, the tape machines had mic inputs. So you buy an 8-track, here's an 8-track. There's an 8-track Ampex tape recorder. They had mic inputs. So like on an Aretha Franklin, which I heard recorded on that machine in that studio, Tommy Cogbill on bass, his microphone would be plugged right into one of those channels, and they would use the volumes in the front as an attenuator. Her microphone was plugged directly into another track. Her piano was plugged directly into another track. The drums were always recorded on one track. And Tommy Dowd put a microphone up years ago, like in the 50s, or early 60s, 50s, and you must not touch that mic. And the kick drum has to be right where he says you put it and all that. And if you listen to Respect, which was recorded in the studio, it sounds fantastic. And the drum sound is great. The bass sound is great. So it's direct to tape, bypassing any console. They didn't have fancy preamps that we have now. So I got to hang out in that studio a little bit, and I actually had the balls to tell Arif Mardin that he wanted to know what was wrong with one of his. He did the score to You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, recorded in that studio. And he came in on a playback. I was supposed to keep quiet. I was sitting in the back of the studio. And he said, something's wrong with it. I can't put my finger on it. So I went to my friend Bruce Turgeson, and I whispered in his ear, the French horns are out of tune. So Bruce turns around and goes, "Hey, my friend Tony says the French horns are out of tune," you know. And I thought I was going to be like thrown out the window. But Arif was a lovely, kind man. He said, he's absolutely right. I'll ask them to tune up. And like, I feel like in some small way I contributed to that. So every time you hear the dun da da dun 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 dun, the French horns, I told them that they were out of tune.
Did you get to meet Ahmet Ertegun?
Yes, I did in later years. I mean, he was. It was very hard not to meet Ahmet Ertegun. He was in New York. He was the man. You know, he was like everywhere. So from that, I went to humble beginnings. I eventually, I'll just go. Well, then I had home studios that, of course, were based on tape. So there's another one of my home studios. So I made a patch bay out of plywood. I believe in the direct approach. And I had a 4-track TIAC, a 2-track Revox. The Revox in the 70s, if you were a professional, you owned a Revox machine, and you could actually bring your master or a copy master home and listen to the analog tape at any speed, like at 15 IPS. And then I had an 8-track Tascam. So I did some crazy demos in this, but they were just demos to work out. I owned a studio, and this is my control room. This is where we mixed fashion. That's a Trident TSM console. All the EQ is on faders. This section here is the EQ section right here. And they are overlapping frequencies. There's four bands of EQ. And my friend Malcolm Toft, who taught me how to engineer, that's another story, is now making this. He designed the circuits, and you can buy these channels now. It's the sound of rock and roll. Like all the Bowie, Ziggy Stardust stuff went through this kind of EQ. Queen went through that EQ and all that. And I had a desk full of this stuff here. You know, all of like, I don't know, 40 channels of it. And I had, this was a tape recorder made in Denmark. It was called a Lyric. And it was it was like a cheaper version of a Studer, but it served me well. Eventually that was replaced by other machines. But this is like in this incarnation. I had some of my outboard gear, my 1176s and all that. And the other thing, this was a nice safe haven because all my rock star musician friends had tax situations where they had to record on the sneak. In the UK, they weren't allowed to record in the UK. They would be taxed heavily if they recorded in the UK. So like I did a lot of albums in the studio I couldn't get a credit for because we would blow our cover. But that was like one of the happiest situations of my life because this is when I was engineering full-time too. I knew my studio. I knew it well. And, you know, I was like Tommy Dowd in a way, like put the drums there. I know how to get a killer sound, put the guitar amps there and all that. And I had a great collection of microphones. So I had 2 valve U47s, tube U47s, which I got from an auction at Shepperton Studios. The Shepperton Studios was a film studio that closed, and they auctioned off all their gear. And the first bid was, what do I hear for 2 Neumann U47 microphones? And the British being very like laid back, very like shy and all that. Nobody was raising their hands. I said, £100. He said, okay, do I hear 150? Nobody would outbid me. He said, gone for £100. The next pair went for £2,000. Everyone said, well, I want one, I want, you know, everyone was afraid to, you know, I just like said, oh, £100. I thought I'd pay 500, maybe I would have paid £1,000. But my mic arsenal was fantastic. And unfortunately, when I sold the studio in '89, I had to sell most of this stuff, you know.
And you raise a great point in talking about the cost of everything because clearly you're standing proudly in your studio. Where was that? Was that Dean Street?
This is in Dean Street in Soho, between Old Compton and Shaftesbury Avenue.
And which is still a famous studio. But how do you go from, you know, having a home studio to be able to afford to, you know, buy/rent a studio like that, buy all the gear that you need?
Well, this studio was actually not that expensive. I was in this, you know, and I'm not bragging. I mean, you know, I had hit records. So I had a bad tax year, where I was going to get hit very heavily for a lot of taxes. And I went to my accountant, and he said, spend it. He goes, don't give it to the Queen. Spend the money. You know who I'm talking about when I said the Queen. And so I built this studio. I found this premises, and I always had a little home studio. And I said, okay, and I dumped like a lot of money in this, so I didn't have to declare it as earnings, as income. So that's something you might think of it. That situation still exists. If you make a lot of money and you're going to pay 50% of your income on tax, it's better to spend the money as much as you can. Then you'll declare. You can actually make a loss, and that's even better. Then you don't owe any tax. But you can't do it illegally. I did it legally by buying all this equipment and all that. And this wasn't the most expensive studio I had. So this was like, I would say, I built the studio in '72 when I had Get It On was a hit. I had like 3 T-Rex hits in a year. And I was selling 65,000 copies of a single a day. So I had a lot of money I had to get rid of.
As you do. But prior to this, am I right in thinking you were one of the very first people in the UK to have a home 16-track studio?
Yeah, well, this studio, I built it at home because I thought, what a great idea, and I could work in my own time. And I built a studio in a terraced house in Melrose Terrace in Shepherd's Bush. And I used an earlier Trident desk there. Let's see. I grew a beard. And let's see. Where is that little studio? Oh, here it is. It's a shame you can't see the reds, but it's a very colorful photo. There's 2 Revoxes. There's a Trident B range on the left. The Trident B ranges are, they're so in use all over the world. It's a really valued sound. And the Moog synthesizer on the right. So that was my home studio, and it was 16-track. And I had barely finished building it when I got a call from Bowie, and he said, I'm making a new album. It's called, it wasn't actually called Diamond Dogs, but it became Diamond Dogs. And he said, I can't get a decent mix all over town. I've tried every engineer, every studio. And I said, well, I'm just building one. Why don't you try mine? He showed up in an hour. And all I had was, instead of chairs, I had carpenter's horses where you saw wood. Those. So we mixed we did the first night's work sitting on carpenter horses. And it wasn't a day where you always had a camera ready or a cell phone ready to take a picture. I would have loved to have had a picture of David Bowie and myself sitting on a pair of wooden, carpenter's horses mixing Diamond Dogs. And he went home with the mix in his hand and called me at 5 in the morning. I was already asleep, but he called me at 5 in the morning. He says, let's do it at your place. It's great sound. And the next day, a moving van pulled up, and out came an entire dining room set with tables and chairs, glasses, corkscrew, and 2 seats to mix at. And I wasn't even living in the house yet. My family was yet to move in. It was a very generous gesture. And every night we would just order a meal, and we'd go into the studio and eat a meal together, and then go back and mix. So that was my first foray. But it was after this that I really needed to, get a bigger place, and that's when I moved to the other place. And I ended up getting the 9th SSL in the world at the other place. And I don't have a picture of the SSL console, but it was an E-series, and it was a 48-channel SSL. I went 48-track then. And that was the most expensive studio I ever bought. And that's when it got scary. I finally found myself in the studio business, and, especially that kind of a studio where I needed 10 staff to help me run it. Had 3 engineers, 2 assistants, administration people, and I was running a record label as well. And so when I was mainly my own client, and I could charge, because I had a very rare desk, an SSL, I could charge £2,000 a day. And I was getting it for a while, for about a brief period, about 2-year period. And then suddenly everyone said, well, you buy an SSL and it's money in the bank. All of a sudden there was a glut of SSLs in London, and the prices, like in the beginning I was charging £2,000 a day, it went down to £500 a day. But still it wasn't bad in the 70s. But my desk was mortgaged. I had to pay the bank. I couldn't afford £1 million desk. But I made it work. It was great. As I said, if I was the client, my own client, I could fill it up full of rock stars and have a great time.
Another piece of kit that you were famously the first person to have was something called the Harmonizer.
Yes.
Tell us about when you discovered that toy.
Well, it was in the... again, I was always kind of cutting edge when it came to gear. If something came out, I had to have it. And this was the beginning of the digital era when they were, we used to make slapback echo with a tape machine. Somebody was in charge of starting that machine, turning the reel over to get the slapback. And suddenly this company from, I believe, California called Eventide put out digital delays. And it was incomprehensible how it worked. Like you'd put sound in there, there's nothing moving, and it would flap out, a couple of milliseconds later, and this was a miracle. So I bought it. I bought the Digidesign digital delay. At the end, you could also freeze. You could sample a sound momentarily. So at the end of the Diamond Dogs, there's a song called Big Brother, and you could hear the word repeated over and over again, bruh, 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 and it fades out. That's how the album ends. What I did was I tried to put the entire word brother in there, but because the computers weren't what they are now, and memory wasn't what it is now, I could only get bruh in it. Still, it was very cool. So if you listen to the end of that, it should have been brother, 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 like that. So the other thing I bought, they came out with this thing called a harmonizer, which you probably all know what it is by now. But for the first time in the history of recording, or the history of the world, well, let's say recording, you could change the pitch of something without slowing the speed or raising the speed of the tape. And of course, if you raise the speed of the tape, you also raise the tempo or lower the tempo just to get to drop the pitch, And some singers needed to do that. I mean, there were many reasons why you did that, but ideally you wanted to stay in the actual tempo of the song. And the harmonizer can do that without it changing it. Like you just put a note C in and you just raise the knob until the C becomes an F. It's just child's play. But I noticed it did other things. So I had it for about a month, and I tested every sound I had from my mixtapes and all that. And what it did to a snare drum was just incredible. It kind of dropped the pitch, and then with the feedback knob, I would feed back the drop pitch, so the pitch would continue to drop. And I get a phone call from David and Brian Eno, and they said, we're going to do an experimental album in France, in Château d'Hérouville in France. And they said, what can you bring to the table? We want to be far out, man. We want to go as far as we can. I said, I've got a harmonizer. They go, great, what does it do? And I said this spontaneously. I said, well, and I knew they would love this. I said, it fucks with the fabric of time. And at the other end of the phone, I heard them go, woo-wee! So it was great. It was absolutely great. I'm sure this is going to go on the Red Bull site.
Oh, don't worry, we've heard
All
worse.
these fucks.
Yeah, it's all good.
So anyway, I got the gig anyway, but I brought the harmonizer there, and we did use it on the drums, and it was so strange at first. I was recording the output of the harmonizer on track 24, and David said, let's just keep it quiet until later. We weren't sure we were going to use it, but we used it, and I got more letters and phone calls from producers saying, how did you do that?
And did you tell them?
No.
This brings us neatly onto, 3 massively influential records, often referred to as the Berlin Trilogy, that you worked on with David and Brian Eno. Can you set the scene, before we get into it, can you set the scene of what the music kind of landscape was like at the time? Because obviously electronics started to figure very heavily on this record, and, David moved to Berlin. Was that a musical mission that he decided to go there to sort of get inspiration, or was it just a lifestyle thing that he wanted to change his environment?
It was initially a lifestyle change. He wanted to escape. I think the way he tells it, he was all messed up and with the wrong people in LA, and he moved to Berlin, probably one of the furthest places you can go and avoid, the rock and roll scene, which of course now it's completely different, but it's because of David. Berlin is such a great open city to rock and music, But there were some heroes of his, Tangerine Dream, Edgar Froese, I don't know, I can't say his name too well, and Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, of course, came from, I think, Cologne. I don't think they came from Berlin, but we loved those 2 bands, and Kraftwerk for the pristine, precise recording. The Autobahn record they made was the first one, but then the Showroom Dummies and the I forget the name of the album, but we loved that sound.
Yeah, I think they're from Berlin, right?
No, they weren't from Berlin.
Dusseldorf.
Dusseldorf.
They recorded in Hansa, though, right? Is that right?
No, they recorded in Connie Plank Studios, right?
Okay.
Kling Klang
Kling
Studios.
Klang. Cannes are from Cologne. Yeah.
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 But yeah, there was a big German influence, and it came out, especially in Heroes. That's where the German influence came out. You know?
And so the first record that you made was a record called Low, which was actually recorded in France. Am I right?
Yes, but we finished it in Germany.
Mm. We should definitely play one song from each of these three records because they're so significant.
Well, if you want to hear that, especially that snare drum sound too, put "Be My Wife." It's pretty stark, this one. Dennis Davis, by the way, was the only person who could hear it. He had it in his headphones while he was playing drums, and he actually played the harmonizer. He realized that the pitch dropped to a greater or lesser degree depending on how he hit it. So he was actually playing this machine. So here it is, "Be My Wife." Thank you.
So the harmonizer was the snare on that?
Yeah, the harmonizer was on the snare. And on the side, too, which was all kind of ambient and new agey sounding, we used the harmonizer on other instruments, too, but it would be hard for me to point out exactly where. It was more or less on everything. Like Moss Garden.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that
this is beautiful music.
Which track do you want from the B-side?
Is it Moss Garden?
Let me get
is that on there, or am I thinking of Heroes?
Yeah, I think that's Heroes.
Okay, what have you got there? Art Decade.
We've got
that's
also
great.
Art Decade, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sully, thank you. A lot of those sounds were generated from not the Mellotron but the Chamberlin, which is it was a better version of the Mellotron. So the cellos in there were from the keyboard, the Chamberlin actually sampled cellos, and all those dropping things was Brian Eno on the little synthy, the EMS synthy. It's like a synthesizer in a suitcase. If you can get your hands on one of them, it's just the best thing in the world to make sounds on. You know, you have to. There's no patches. You just have to start from scratch. But you can do all sorts of things. You could put a guitar or something in the input and process any instrument or a voice or a drum kit with filters. So it was the beginning of all that. Started with this peculiar keyboard, and then a lot of those like strange sounds was just David scraping an E string on a guitar and heavy echo chamber like that, and put through the harmonizer and all that. Harmonizer makes everything sound like it's from another planet. Yeah.
And talking of your relationship with Brian Eno, obviously he's closely associated with electronic and ambient music.
Yes.
Does it frustrate you, though, that often people associate him so closely with these three records that they mistakenly think he produced them?
Well, of course, he should be associated with him. He was a composer on a lot of the songs, and he's a great producer, but I produced it.
Yeah.
And that's the fact. Which I think it's journalists who are, like they kind of look for, who don't bother to read the credits, like David Bowie, Brian Eno. Okay, I'll just put those names up, and Tony Visconti is just an afterthought. So over the years, like Brian Eno has gotten some credit for producing these three tracks, these three albums, but he's always gone down on record saying it was me, it was Tony, and they was very, very kind about putting the record straight. But I mean, and so probably if you do a web search now, I think pretty much the Brian Eno references are very, 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 very way down on the list, But I love the man. I enjoyed working with him so much. He taught me a lot.
And paint the picture for us at the time about the chemistry between the three of you, because what came out was pretty radical, and also I've heard you describing the making of that album as pretty miserable at the best of times. Why was that?
Well, we booked the studio at the last minute, and it was in France, and it was the month of August, and most Europeans go on holiday in August, take the entire month off, and the French were not going to stay behind for us. They were going to go on their holiday. So they left us with an English guy, Andy, I forget his surname, but he was like the studio tech, which they hired just for us. So he was looking after us in the studio, and because the Brits don't take August off, not to my knowledge, but all of Europe does. And then we had one woman who was looking after the food for us, and we would get. They had one. The owner used to hunt rabbits and all that, and
This is a castle or something in
it
France.
was a beautiful castle. It was a chateau, and it was reported that the ghosts of Georges Sand and Frédéric Chopin walked the halls, which they did. We all had a supernatural experience there. But anyway, every night at dinner we'd get about 12 cooked rabbits on the table, and that was it. And because the whole staff was on, so we were pretty messed up about this. And on the third night, I said, "Is it possible to get vegetables? You know, and by the way, I don't eat rabbit." And so, like on the third night, they just threw about 4 heads of lettuce on the table with oil and vinegar bottles. So we thought they were really, really shitty people to us, you know. And then they left out. They bought us a lot of cheese, which they left out, and I don't know. We wouldn't cover it up, and it would be covered with flies. So both David and I came out with gastric diseases. We were pretty sick. But until that, it really broke down. The first 2 weeks, Brian was there, Brian Eno, and we were doing all the experimental stuff, and the band was there too. It was like when the band left and Brian left, that's kind of when it really got, you know, really decayed. And we found out that the person who was looking after us, this lovely French lady, was actually a journalist doing a sneak preview of this album. So she went and told everybody what all our private conversations over dinner and all that was reported in a French newspaper. So I mean, you know, when you're David Bowie, you have special security measures. We never thought of screening people, but I think we did afterwards. So we fired her on the spot, and when we found out, but the harm was done. So, and then David was going through a deposition in Paris. He was suing. He and his manager were splitting up. So a few days a week he had to go to Paris, and he'd come back completely depressed because you know, he was, every day was like he's going to lose more and more money on this deal, you know, just to get rid of his manager. So he was pretty despondent and pretty low, and he's a very honest man. Like all this music you know, he was breaking up with his wife too. That's what the Be My Wife is about. So this music all came from his soul.
So it was literally low.
It was very low, yeah.
And so tell us about moving into Heroes. Well, first of all, how was it received? I mean, it's pretty radical to have, obviously we listened to the music we played before is pretty traditional song-based, you know,
well,
rock music.
Low was, first of all, rejected by his label, RCA. They said there's not enough Bowie on it. That was the A-side was just 6 songs with vocals, and then the B-side was all the ambient music. And one cigar-chewing executive said, "I'm going to buy him a house in Philadelphia. I want him to make Young Americans too," you know. So that's the way it was initially received. But the everyone else, like that we played it for, loved it, and we finally, including Tony DeFries, who was Bowie's ex-manager, who was entitled to a cut of his future royalties, tried to get the record rejected by RCA as well. He was not on our side. But we had this remarkable piece of music which we were so proud of, and you know, the whole premise was it was going to be an experiment, and if we didn't like it, no one would have ever heard it. We were going to just erase the tapes and get rid of it. But we were so pleased with it in the end. So we pushed for its release, and when it was released, all hell broke loose. All the journalists, you know, for a change, like I think every journalist, British journalist, loved it, said it was the most incredible, ingenious record. It was the best thing he could have done. Instead of doing Young Americans again, he goes and does this experimental album, and we had the British press on our side, and the fans absolutely loved the album too. So luckily we persevered and we got the thing released.
And when you went over there with Brian and David, did you expect that you were going to come back with all these pieces of instrumental music as well as songs? Or
we talked about it, and then we tried it out, and it worked. The way we did it is we did have a primitive click track, and we didn't want to give the tempo away. So we recorded about 500 clicks, and I was on another track counting them off. 2, 56, 57. You know, I'd like to hear that track actually. It was very meditational. You know, if you get up to 150, like you're spaced out. So the whole thing was so wacky, but we did not know that we were going to use that many. We were thinking maybe doing one track. You know, it turned out to be the whole second side of the album.
And you're talking about DJs earlier. I mean, how did the DJs react to that record? Who was playing it?
Well, we gave them. There was a hit single called "Sound and Vision," and it was really a nice bouncy track. And it was really, again, pretty revolutionary because David doesn't come in singing until 1:30. You know, this like instrumental until 1:30, and then he says, "Don't you wonder sometime?" This is the first time you hear his voice. Yeah, so we had that. I think "Be My Wife" was a single that got airplay as well.
But did you get airplay on the ambient and electronic music?
Oh no, absolutely not. Yeah.
So let's move on to possibly David Bowie's most celebrated record, Heroes. And he was living in Berlin at the time.
Yes.
Paint the picture of Hansa Studios and the recording process.
He was, let's see, where was he living? He was living in the Turkish Quarter, the area of Berlin, it was kind of a working class neighborhood. And of course the Berlin Wall was still up. And it was a very bizarre situation because every day we would see military tanks in the street, you know, really big, huge tanks that were like almost, you know, story and a half high. They were like 15, 20 feet high with big gun turrets in the front, and then black Jeeps. It wouldn't be like the standard military green. They would be matte black. And it was like almost like being in an Arnold Schwarzenegger film, you know, future film. It was like this was happening then in the 70s. And the city was surrounded by basically a wall and a moat that was mined. So if you fancied jumping in the moat to swim across from East Berlin to West Berlin, you'd probably be either caught in barbed wire or you would be exploded. You would just blow up. And there were a few checkpoints, and we went through Checkpoint Charlie. If you had an American passport or a British passport, you could go into East Berlin. And when you went into East Berlin, you were going into about 30 years in the past. They had, because it was a communist territory, there were no brand names, but they had billboards where they had a picture of a fish, and it said, "Eat fish." Then they had a billboard with a milk bottle, "Drink milk," in German, you know. And no products there were no products in a communist country then. And the women were dressed as if it was the 50s. They had narrow skirts and beehive hairdos and stiletto heels. And that was like when a woman went out for the night, she would dress like it was 1955, you know. And it was the most bizarre situation. But David actually, one night he was parked by the wall on the west side, and he reported that he was like having a cigarette with a girl in his car, and a red army guard knocked on his window and asked him for a light. Now this guy shouldn't have been on the west. He actually came underneath wacky stuff used to happen like this. He came under the river, an underground passage, and he asked for a light, and he had the red star on his hat. David was so freaked out. Hey, you guys should be over there, you know, on the other side. Which is a lyric from The Wall, from Heroes, actually.
And how did all of that inform the recording process? Have you got any pictures, by the way, of that era?
Yeah, well, we were freaked out because to our lovely assistant engineer, Edu Meyer, he lived with this, you know, so to him it was nothing special. But to us, the control room of Hansa faced the wall, faced the Berlin Wall. And in the daytime, you could see the Red Guards looking at us through binoculars. Of course, they knew it was a recording studio. And that window there, that faces the Berlin Wall. And that I was standing up on a chair taking a picture. That's Edu Meyer on the left. There's Bowie's son, Zoe, in those days he was called Zoe, in the middle, and there's Bowie on the extreme right. And we're listening to a playback. And it's funny, it's the first time I've ever seen this, but in Germany, they didn't have the double-sided tape reels. It was just the bottom was there, and you'd put the top of the tape on there like a cake, like a pie or something like that. We used, looping is not a new thing, so here's a tape loop, and of some kind of a beat or something like that, with Bowie making a very comical pose of being inside the loop there. So we got up to a lot of shenanigans, but the one time we told Edu, we said, "Doesn't it freak you out that the guards are looking at us all the time?" Because they were about 500 feet away. And he says, "No," and he took the overhead light and he flashed it in their eyes and he stuck his tongue out. And David and I dove to underneath the board and said, "Don't do that, don't do that, don't do that." So all this kind of edge was in all the recording. And I've got an actual picture of David Just before I took this picture, he asked me to leave. He was having trouble with lyric writing. Those are meatballs and cannelloni. And there you go. There's David Bowie writing Heroes. He's actually writing the song in that moment. And this is, Hansa was the room that we recorded in. We didn't have like a glass window, so it was, we could only see the people. I mean, if I had a better resolution there, there's actually the drum kit. You know, but we communicated via CCTV. And when things were a little boring, which was hardly ever, Dennis Davis would be on the camera, and then he'd be doing he would mime a television show for us, and he'd have us in hysterics. But anyway, this is David in a very serious moment writing Heroes, and now you can only see his cigarette. So there you go.
Can we play something from there? New Cone or Moss Garden?
Well,
like that.
they would be, yeah. And you know something? I have to go to men's room so
I'd like
bad.
to as well, yeah.
Should we take a little break? Hey! Okay.
Thanks for the break there, Tony. That was a good idea. Everyone feeling good? Still up for it? Are we still here? Yeah. Let's make Mr. Visconti feel welcome. It's been an amazing couple of hours already. I'm sure you'll agree. Thank you so much already.
You know, my biggest fear was that you guys wouldn't like older music because you're so much into house music and beats and all that. But thank you for being such a great, attentive group of people. Thank you very much. I wouldn't call you an audience because you're all musicians in your own right. So it's nice to be addressing a group of musicians. Fantastic.
So we left off on the middle of the three, on the second of the three Berlin albums that were so important, and we just heard some excerpts from Heroes and the last one from Low. The third record was sort of less electronic in a way. It seemed to be some sort of reaction to the first two. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, every place influenced where we worked, and the third album, although it's called the third album in the Berlin Trilogy, we actually never recorded a note of it in Berlin. We recorded it in Switzerland. David used to live in Switzerland, and there was a local kind of radio station studio called Mountain Studios, and its whole purpose was really to broadcast the Montreux festivals, you know, jazz festivals and all that. And it was a really small studio, no ambience, like the complete opposite of Berlin. And to me, I've always found that recording a bit like dead sonically, but great songs and all that. And we pulled off some of the tracks sound really good, but a lot of it, I just wish I could have done them. We mixed them in this really bad studio in New York, and it was always like we were both. For this mix, we were up against a deadline. We had to deliver the album by a certain date. And I don't know why David didn't stop and say, no, we'll deliver it when it's ready, because the mixes were good, but I didn't have a lot of gear. I didn't have a lot of equipment. It was very much the opposite of a great British or a great European studio, which always has lots of gear. You know, this New York studio just had the bare bones. And I spoke to David maybe a couple of months ago. He said, do you fancy remixing the album? I said, yes, please. You know, I'd love to remix this album. But we had one great song, which was pretty electronic. And we had a beatbox. You know, Roland made these beatboxes with the habanera, cha-cha-cha, mambo on them. And we had a great electronic technician for part of Bowie's crew. And these beatboxes traditionally had one mono output. And he had nothing to do for a few days, so he got in there and he put every single sound on there, like the kick drum, the snare drum, everything. He gave it a separate output, so we had something like 16 discrete outputs from this beatbox, which was the first of its kind to do that. It was a custom job. And we went a bit crazy with it on one song, which started out as a jam on Dale Hawkins' Susie Q. Oh, Susie Q. How do you do? And for some reason, it turned out like this. But underneath it, there's the drumming structure is based on Susie Q. But this is where Brian Eno is going apeshit on the beatbox. He loved it, and you'll hear it. And it's called African Night Flight. It's very modern sounding, even by today's standards. And David's, I'd say, rapping on it, for want of a better word. So here's African Night Flight. If you ever wondered what Brian Eno looks like without his shirt on, there he is. That was during the making of, I think he's actually recording what he did. He stole this from John Cage with the treated piano, where he had tacks and tape in there and treated piano. So that was during this track, recorded during this track.
Do you want to talk us through some of the photos you were flying through there? Because there's some other good ones in there.
Well, I don't know, you know. You saw that one. This is the actual music for Cosmic Dancer as played by the string section on T-Rex, Cosmic Dancer. That's me playing a great bass recorder. This is shortly after I met David. That's David in the middle. This is David Bowie and his girlfriend Kitty. And that's me, and that's my first wife Sigrid. She is a German lady. And my mom and my dad and my two friends, Stan and Myron. And that's at Elgin Avenue in London, Maida Vale. That's me and my gold discs. It's taken a year ago, would you believe it? I aged a lot in a year. I told you that for some reason we can't get red out of the computer onto that screen, so you're seeing everything in glorious blue and yellow. That's a gig I did with David when I was part of his backing band called The Hype. And that's me in the long underwear. I was Hype Man. We were all cartoon characters. He was Rainbow Man. The guitar player, Mick Ronson, was Gangster Man. He wore a gold lame suit and a gangster's hat and all that. And we did this gig at the Roundhouse and played in front of all these like long-haired hippies and all that. And we thought we'd be different and all that. It was a strange reaction. Some people adored us and some people were jeering us. And then the funniest thing is after this show, all our clothes were stolen in the dressing room. And we had to go home wearing that stupid outfit. That's David and I in 2001. We're doing an album called Heathen. And we're up in the Catskill Mountains at Alair Studios. I mean, I don't want to elaborate on it. You saw that my mom fed every band I had from England. They'd have to go to Brooklyn, New York, to eat my mom's food, which was legendary at the time. And that's Mark and Bill Legend, Mickey Finn, my mom. That's my girlfriend Liz. And that's Steve Curry, the bass player. All fine musicians, that whole band. That's a picture of me conducting a session in London for the group Sparks. It was a brass section, a song called Get in the Swing. That's actually very hard to see, but David and the band and I, we all lived in a house called Haddam Hall in Beckenham, Kent, so that's a little jam session we're having. That's the drummer, John Cambridge, there on guitar. Mick Ronson is on the extreme right. And there's David in the middle, but he's pretty much in shadow. I don't know who the girl is. Hey, Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy. I did 3 Thin Lizzy albums, and he was one of the most talented musicians I've ever worked with. Larger-than-life person. That guy was Mr. Rock and Roll, and I don't want to tell you some of the story. I don't know to tell you why, but what a great guy. He's from Dublin. That's David and I at a gig in Beckenham, Kent, at the Arts Lab. And I looked like on the left, I looked like I belonged in Nirvana, didn't I? So did he. David trying to play a theremin, as we all do, and find out that it's impossible to play. Oh, I could play theremin. That's Paul McCartney. I did a few records with him, and he's looking at me skeptically because I snuck a camera into the session. I took a picture of him. But, like nowadays, everyone's got cell phones and like that. There was a time when you couldn't bring a camera into a recording studio. It was like really forbidden because it was like sanctuary. It was like, this is where I'm not going to be a rock star. I'll be a rock star outside of the studio, but in the studio, I just want to create music, and that's... I did a very cheeky thing by snapping that picture, but what the hell, It's called Paul McCartney. This is, Phil Collins. He went through a brief period before he was in Genesis and after he was fired from the band, and he was a session drummer. And there he is. He's working for me on an album that I was doing with, I forget the name of the group, but that's Phil Collins, the session man, with hair and a beard. And that's my studio in Shepherd's Bush. Klein and Hummel speakers are on the wall there. and that was a Trident B range desk, and that was the remote. This is the remote control for the MCI 16 track. I can't find my cursor. Yeah, that's the remote for the MCI. Let's see, where am I? Phil Collins. That's David in the basement in Beckenham, Kent again. We're living in this communal apartment, and he's down there practicing. And I like this photo. It's like an old coal bin, you know. They used to put coal down there. These are all, you know, I was always an amateur photographer, and I especially like to shoot on transparency film. That's a party at my studio. There's, of course, Susie Sue and Bob Geldof and Phil Lynott. I used to have these crazy parties at my studio, at Christmas party, you know, any reason to have like a celebratory party, and things would go missing. I was playing a party tape on my machine, a big reel-to-reel tape, and Susie admitted like 10 years later that she stole it, because I had like unreleased Bowie stuff on there. I thought, I'll give everyone a treat, and that tape went missing afterwards. Luckily, no one stole microphones or guitars, but, you know, we had a great time. That's in recent years. That's Pete Townsend on the left, and that's David Bowie on the right, and we're doing an album called Heathen, and Pete was going to play some guitar. It's a cute story. He heard this track called Slow Burn, and it's quite an emotional song, and he at the end he wiped his eyes, and I said, "Gosh, were you crying?" He goes, "No, it's just a physiological thing. It's just a physiological thing." It's so cool. Physiological thing, my ass. Okay, that's my Trident B range. Oh, that's very hard to see, but that's making of Scary Monsters. That was at the Power Station in New York, which is now called Avatar Studios. And it's like one big sauna. I mean, I don't know. There was a trend in the building studios in the 70s. It had to have that wood, and all they needed was make it hot, and you could take your clothes off and take a sauna. I went through periods, you know, if you get a good drum sound, take a picture of it. And I went through a period where I had a small drum booth, but I did anything to make it bigger. I found these corrugated sheets of metal, you know, it's an alloy, and I put it up against the wall, and it livened up the room so much that, and the microphones would pick it up, but I got it even bigger by putting microphones behind it as well, so picking up, so it was like a very cheap reverb that worked incredibly well. And after this, I was just leaning them against the walls, but afterwards I installed hooks where I hung them. So they really did move with the sonic energy in the room, and I got great drum sounds in that place. I mean, too many albums to mention right now.
What's the craziest contraption you've ever built in the studio for the purposes of sound?
Oh, coming up to that. Let's see, where is that?
You have a photo of it?
Oh, that's the drum room again. Well, there.
Oh.
So, you know, the sum and difference microphone technique for classical music, it's this very strange microphone technique. You have two microphones, one is on figure 8 and one is on cardioid, and you put them out of phase and you bring their sum up on a third channel. And when you get the sum of those two out of phase microphones at a certain point, you get an extremely wide stereo that also works in mono. When you put it in mono, you don't get any drop of the size. It's a beautiful technique. It comes from classical music, and a lot of great classical recordings, and the first stereo recordings were done with just these two microphones set up. It's a spectacular sound. As I said, when you convert it to mono, there's just no loss of the left and right, you know, and there's no center channel. It's very strange. And usually you use this technique for really big, wide open spaces, but I made a tunnel out of that corrugated metal, and I did the microphone sum and difference. So in that small space, I created a wide stereo sound of that guitar amp. And so, I mean, that's what you do. You have to do things like that. You know, this is before boxes were invented with presets, so you just had to do crazy stuff. And I can't tell you how many bathrooms I've recorded in, too. You'd be in a bathroom, like Trident Studios in St. Anne's Court in London had the best sound for hand claps. So we'd just put an expensive microphone in the men's room, and we'd sit around clapping hands and all that. Then eventually the guitar amps would creep into the men's room, and then the people on the street would complain, like the people who had shops would complain that we're making too much noise. So you'd have to do the recording in the. But they have this like $1 million studio, and here we are putting the microphones in the men's room. I mean, and also at Avatar Power Station, we found the best reverb was in the hallway. So we were on the 4th floor. We put a microphone on the 2nd floor and a microphone on the 4th floor and just the 6th floor, and just open the door and put a guitar amp on the 4th floor. And that sound is all over Scary Monsters. So you just you record where you find the best sound. That's it. This is, again, a lovely Neve console at Allaire Studios in the Catskill Mountains, where we made Heathen. And it was a unique control room in the sense that there was no glass window. The control room and the studio were all open, and I would get my sounds on very well form-fitting headphones and then just play it back and see if it sounded good and all that. So we got some incredible drum sounds in there with Matt Chamberlain playing drums. He's another trip. I don't know if you know Scary Monsters well, but there's a track called It's No Game, and we had it translated into Japanese, and this lovely Japanese lady who was playing in The King and I down the road, she was playing in a theater, she came over to help David pronounce the Japanese, and she found out, she says, this doesn't scan. She goes, this is a literal translation of your lyrics. It's not poetry. It's not going to fit. So you should really play this track. So David said, well, he says, say it to me. And she started reciting it. And this is a brilliant idea of his. He said, could you go in front of the mic and say this song like, instead of like a woman, say it like a samurai. Say it like like a man, And she thought, wow, what a great idea. She was all up for it because she's an actress. And I was told that this was released in Japan as a single, but she was quite amazing. So in the end, she did the like verse 1, and then he would do it in English. But again, he could not sing it in Japanese because they were like too many syllables. So could you play this one? It's No Game. Do you have it? Part one. That's the sound of my 24-track machine. Oh, good. I always wondered if you could. I didn't know. When you do a mix, you don't know how high you're supposed to put the voice. I was hoping Japanese people everywhere would understand that. I didn't.
I mean, clearly we've spent a long time naturally speaking about your work with Bowie and also T-Rex. But I mean, your discography is mind-blowing. Is there, some really special collaborations that you've done outside of those two big relationships that you'd like to mention?
I've produced probably almost 400 albums, and I did about 2 with a group called Gentle Giant. Unfortunately, I don't. You have their music.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was hoping you would.
This was my in the middle of recording
favorite.
all kinds of pop records. I had to do something that could really challenge me musically. And Gentle Giant were all really fantastic musicians. And you know how everything nowadays is mainly 4/4 and 6/8 and all that. There was one song they did that was 15/16 was a key signature, and I had to punch in on certain phrases, but I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, hit the button, And the arrangements, I helped, they had very sophisticated arrangements, and I embellished some of them by playing recorders and making them maybe a little clearer. But I'm so proud of this record, and nothing pleases me more when someone stops me in the street and say, instead of saying, hey, you produced David Bowie, they say, hey, you produced Gentle Giant. And I went, oh, because I put so much work in it, and we sold probably 50 copies, Yeah. But here's Gentle Giant.
Well, it's a classic anyway. I don't know which one to go for. Why not? If it's one, let's give a bit of some blues.
Gentle Giant. We'll play this other one
blues
quickly.
one.
After all that build-up, you're hearing like,
It's good. Yeah. This is the one with the lutes and the. That's
quite a few tricks on there. If you want me to explain them, I will. I remember what we did.
Yeah, please. I mean, that's an unfadable record. There's so many different things to talk about. I'm glad we got a moment to talk about Gentle Giant because I love that piece of music. And I mean, how much of that is Tony Visconti? Who says, oh, let's get in some military drum and some timpani and some. And some recorder, and I mean...
I think a lot of that was my idea. Of course, they wrote the songs, but I think with the timpani, we didn't have enough timpani, so that the person who played the timpani wasn't the drummer, I think it was the organist. And we actually had to write it out because we had to do one half of it with the timpani tuned at certain pitches. It's a chromatic instrument, and then the other half at other pitches. So that was 2 tracks of timpani, like, you know, like he playing, but then he'd play the next part after we got the first part and tuned up. The drum fill slowing down at the end was, I mixed all the drums to stereo tape and did this as an insert. I flew it into the multi-track and just slowed the machine down as this drum fill ended. So that was no harmonizer, that was my left hand. Yeah. You know, like that. And then of course backwards echo, which was something, it's like you could do it on analog tape pretty easily. You record the echo forward. No, you flip the tape over. Then you add the echo to the backwards snare drum. So the snare drum will go like that, and then the echo will go, the reverb will go afterwards. When you flip the tape over, the reverb comes first. So it goes like that. So only on that one, the backwards sound was only the reverb backwards. The drums were forward. So, I mean, there were so many tricks on that. I remember them. And the overdubs, there were 6 people. They played all those are all real instruments, no samples. The violinist also played cello, and one of the brothers played clarinet, and I think we hired a bass clarinet for that session, which he played. So it's a bass clarinet and a normal clarinet. And it was just amazing experience.
Must have been a lot of fun.
It was fun. It was like, put a few gray hairs on my head too. You know, it was just great challenge to make music like that.
That's from a record called Acquiring the Taste, and there's also the self-titled Gentle Giant album as well, both of which you should definitely check out if you're not familiar. Are there any artists that you didn't get to work with that you felt that you really wanted to or should have done?
Good question.
I mean, alive or dead or otherwise.
No, I always loved Bob Dylan, and I was such a fan, and I thought, it'd be great to work with him, but I won't say who, but I've always been disillusioned, sometimes disillusioned. There's someone I idolize and I would work with them, and I just didn't want to know them as human beings. I preferred to know them as idols, you know, as icons. So I never worked with Bob Dylan, although I did at one point. And the Rolling Stones I did work with briefly and all that, and if you've read Keith Richards' autobiography, you know that they were hard work. I mean, they led many engineers and producers into early graves. And I'm glad in a way that, you know, I was enough of a bad boy. I didn't need the Rolling Stones to contribute to that, but I did love their music. And I you know, one of my big dreams was to work with the Beatles, and I did Band on the Run with Paul McCartney, and I worked on this Mark Bolan T-Rex film called Born to Boogie with Ringo. And George Harrison I jammed with. I didn't work with him, but I went to Apple one afternoon when they were on 3 Savile Road, when Apple had their headquarters on Savile Road. And I went down in the basement, and George and Paul were jamming, and I picked up a bass and jammed with both of them. So that was like a dream come true. But I could never make a Beatles album. I couldn't step into George Martin's shoes, you know. But at least I met them and I played some stuff with them. I did some things with them, you know. But of my generation, the Beatles were just God. I don't know if you have, in your generation, you have anyone like that, but I'm sure you do. But, you know, for me to meet the Beatles was definitely like meeting Bootsy back there, too. It was the same thing. Bootsy's gone now. I can't tell you. I couldn't stop smiling when he walked in. I turned to Benji, I said, who just walked in? Bootsy. I went, oh, God, I'm going to die, you know. Yeah, what a nice guy, too. Yeah. But, you know, I would have loved to have worked with him, and I probably might in the future. You know, we're still around. We survived the 70s. That is some achievement.
Well, yeah. Maybe even this afternoon.
I'm Rick James.
Talking about, you know, people putting grey hairs on your head and sort of the stress of the studio, is there a particular kind of studio etiquette that you lay down? Are you quite strict about particular rules within a studio environment?
Yeah, well, you've heard me talk about drugs a lot, and I have to tell you that being the head of the team, which is me, I never did drugs in the studio. Maybe I would be a liar if I said I never did. A few times, but I have been with bands where they're wrecked, and I'm the last person standing because I have to be. And there's only one time, I don't mind bands drinking and smoking a little bit. If it's going to get them in the mood, that's fine, you know. I can't afford to do it. First of all, if you smoke weed and listen to sound, you hear different things that are really there. You know, you're adding a lot to it. And then for alcohol, it cuts down your high frequencies. It goes the other way. If you drink and work, you're hearing less and less high frequencies. And I think like 2 beers cuts your high frequency response by up to 15 dB. It's been proven. been proven. I don't know where the papers are, but it's been proven. So I try to keep my band sober and minimally drug-free. And I'd say in the last 2 years, it hasn't been much of a problem. I've rarely seen stoners in the studios in the last decade. I mean, that was very much a 70s thing. And so that's the one thing I like. I like a drug-free zone now when I work.
And talking about the pressure of the studio, talk to me about talk to us, sorry, about the pressure of hits. Once you've had a hit, you know, as obviously you had loads. As a record producer, you know, when you walk into the studio, is there this sort of invisible weight on your shoulders of having to come out the other side with some sort of hit?
Well, I must have had I think I had an easier time in the 70s because than you have now. Because in the 70s, being different really counted. The labels expect you to come up with something really radically different. That was the name of the game. And the artists themselves were defining that. Like Bowie was one of the forerunners, you know, like Roxy Music. Every time they brought out a record, it was amazing. Like you go, wow, why didn't I think of that, you know? It was really, truly, every record and every artist's, you know, output was a quantum leap from their last one, and we were expected to do that. So, I mean, I got paid for having crazy ideas. That's a great job, you know. Like I can go all wacky. I don't have to imitate anybody. We can just be as freaky as we want. And you know, Bootsy and I were talking about that, how adventurous those times were, how you could really get away with murder, you know, and do the most outrageous things. So there was a pressure because it's simply an economical thing. If you get hits, you will be invited back into the studio. Like right now, it's not the economic pressure isn't so great because we all make music, including myself, at home, on planes, you know, and computers have really dropped the cost of making a record dramatically. So that was the name of the game. I had to get hits, and we worked very hard. You know, like we would. Apart from Low, which we really didn't think we had any singles, and for us it was a statement. It was like, this was probably a wise thing, like no singles on this album when everybody else is putting out singles, you know. In spite of that, we had a decent hit single off of it. I find nowadays, though, it's probably even harder because the record labels want you to be different, but not too different. And there are so many more people making records now than there were in the 70s. It was like, to get signed in those days, you had to go through so many gatekeepers, and only, you know, to get in the door, you had to pass so many tests. And now with self-made records, I think the competition for everybody here is fierce, you know. Mm. There's all kinds of factors that didn't exist when I was making hit records in the 70s. Does that answer your question, or is that depressing enough? I'm sorry, but you know, I really feel for you what you're going through. You know.
No, absolutely. One thing I was interested in, talking about the sort of pressure of making records, and also talking about what it's like now, is what you, having lived through, you know, arguably some classic eras of record production. What do you make of the trend at the moment of doing this throwback style of production where they're trying to emulate? A lot of people wish to emulate the classic sound, whether it be Tamla Motown or whether it be something that you've worked on or a classic rock and roll sound. I mean, do you feel that that's sort of looking backwards too much, or do you see the reasoning in that?
No, I mean, there's so much history of music. There's no reason why you shouldn't borrow from the past and bring something back. Why did it have to just live for 2 years and then die? You know, it's great to bring things back, and it's very healthy. You'll never do it the same way we did it because we did it on analog tape, and as I told you before, it was scary when you had one track left, and there were more contributing factors than just the tape itself or the equipment, you know. But I never believe that the equipment really does it. I think your ears do it. And I was trained in an age when engineers were very secretive. You know, if I went up to an engineer and said, "How did you get that kick drum sound?" He'd laugh at me. He says, "You don't think I'd actually tell you?" You know, people were less sharing in those days. You know, you couldn't go on YouTube and see a seminar on how to mic up a drum kit. So I figured the best thing to do, if they're not going to tell me, I honestly had only 1 or 2 engineers who were generous with me. One was Glyn Johns, and he taught me how to flange tape and phase tape, which I hounded him for. I asked him about 5 times, and he told me to F off 5 times until he finally taught me how to do it. And Malcolm Toff, the guy who designed my desk, actually sat down and he showed me a few skills, you know. And then my boss, Denny Cordell, showed me he taught me a lesson. He says, be unreasonable. Don't ever let an engineer say, I'm not going to do anymore. I like that. You know, you have to really push, a producer has to push everyone. But then I realized if they're not going to tell me their secrets, I'm going to have to figure them out. And I might not have the microphones, I might not have the drum kit, but I like that sound. I'm going to figure out how it's done. And I did. So I worked out a lot of my education by myself.
Mm. And I mean, if you could summarize what the primary role of a record producer is, what would you say?
You're the big boss. And, you know, and you have to be, it depends on, there are all kinds of record producers. There's like Phil Spector, who you had to do everything he told you to do. You had no say in it, whether you were the star of the record or the tambourine player. You did it Phil's way or the highway. And but I think George Martin was the one who said, like, let's cooperate, you know. We have different jobs to do. You have to be the stars. My job is to get your sound on tape and make you sound as good as possible. That's the school I come from, and the buck stops here. You know, like, if it sounds bad, the record label's going to blame me. They're not going to blame the group. And so that's what I mean by this fact that you're the boss. You have to bring it in. You have to bring it home.
Okay, before we open it up to questions, I'd like to ask you a favour. If you've got time and you wouldn't mind, I'm sure we'd all love to have a bit of your time in the main control studio a bit later this evening. Is that something you'd be up for? Getting
Sure. I spoke to you about it yesterday, and I was thinking, I have a very, you want to make a rock record, anybody? Just rock and roll? One, two, we need a drummer. We need as many guitar players. Oh, we have a drummer. As guitar players, you want to come in? We always use more than one.
Yeah.
Bass player,
Yeah.
keyboard,
Two.
Singers. I have a structure in my head. I haven't even heard it yet. I just heard a basic structure. We could do this rock and roll song together, and the lyrics could come from you and all that. And
Pretty famous bass player just walked in as well.
If it takes more than two, oh no, he's back.
No.
If he scares me, he's so good.
No, he's not.
Oh, he's not here. But we'll give it 2 hours, and I think we'll have a jolly good time, you know, and do it all just no tricks, just play live, look at each other while you're playing, have fun, jump up and down, get in the groove. So yeah, if we can try that out.
That'd be most generous. Thank you. Yeah, we look forward to that. We're excited. I know there's going to be loads, so we're going to have to keep it really, really moving really quickly. But who wants to? Okay, I've been told 5 questions. No? 7. Okay. So we've got a little bit of time, but who's first?
Hi.
Hello.
I remember you saying earlier when you moved to London around 67 or so, you made a comment that you found a lot of American music bland, and you thought it like all the good meat was coming from London. I was curious as a producer if you found Brian Wilson as an inspiration at all.
Exceptionally. I love the Beach Boys. And Brian Wilson and the Beatles got into some very healthy competition. They try to outdo each other, and they'd leave little signatures and like little messages to each other. And, you know, when you were a young guy in those days, you picked up on all this stuff, you know, all the little messages and the sounds. I thought Brian Wilson was incredible. But when I left, I'm not sure he did Good Vibrations yet. I think that happened when I was in London. There was still the surfing Beach Boys. And you know, I was raised in a barbershop quartet situation. My dad was a barbershop quarteter, and I loved 4-part harmony. And the Beach Boys were like the best rock and roll barbershop quartet that ever lived, you know. So, yeah, respect for him.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Who's next? Any more? Come on, don't be shy. Jesse.
You know, I don't bite. You know, I'm okay.
How you doing, brother?
Hi, dude.
You were talking a lot about the 70s, but what about the 80s?
It's a bit of a fog, my friend. Well, the 80s were great. You know, you got into those huge bombastic sounds by then, and, you know, Prince was having his heyday, and my God, you know, so many great things came out of the 80s, and I didn't make many great albums in the 80s. My golden decade was the 70s for sure, but I lived through the 80s and I thought it was absolutely great. I liked, in Britain we had Adamant. To this day, I love that man. I saw him as recently as July. He's now he's a full-fledged pirate. He's a buccaneer now. He's got the bandana and he's got a little mustache and all that. And he does concerts and all that. But I made one Adamant album. That was my big contribution to the 80s. I guess there are probably more. I'm being, I don't know, forgetful. Yeah, great decade.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It was still, in the 80s, there was still permission to be who you wanted to be and what you wanted to do. It wasn't so industrial yet. Like the 90s, it was like the end of the music business. It began in the 90s.
Hey, I read that Mark Bolan never drove a car in his whole life. And a lot of lyrics were about that. And
that's right.
Did you guys crack up, and was it funny when you just, I don't know?
Yeah, he couldn't drive a car. He owned a scooter when he was 16. He used to pose. He was a model. And he said he only rode his scooter once and he crashed on it. He said, but he used to pose. It was great. His friend would drive there near Carnaby Street, and he'd just stand next to the scooter all day, a Lambretta. And he could never drive. He'd never trusted himself driving. And ironically, he died in a car crash too. But he wrote about cars being a metaphor also for women. All his cars had female names, and females had car names. Like when he called a woman his Cadillac, It was his luxury car, So he's a cool lyric writer. One of the best rock and roll poets that ever lived, Mark Bolan. And he had an 8-track in his car too. That was terrific.
Cool. Any more questions? Yeah. Can we get? Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Do you want to ask another one? No. Okay. In the picture with Phil Collins, I think in the background there's a sitar against the wall. Yes. Did you have something to do with Indian music?
No, it was my sitar. I had across the road from me, I had a lovely family by the name of Sadri, was their surname. And the husband was a pilot with British Airways, and he used to go back to India a lot. And I said, please bring me back a sitar. And he used to bring me back mangoes. And one day he arrived, he says, here's your sitar. And I tried to play it. I think everybody tried. It was like the theremin. Everyone thinks they can play the sitar too. But I'm a big fan. I've got a lovely picture of an Indian musician I wanted to show you. This guy, his name is Anil Bhagwat. And he was the tabla player on Sgt. Pepper's. And he was and on Revolver, he was the tabla player. And lovely man, he came to work dressed in a suit and a tie. But that George Harrison song, With You or Without You, the wild tabla playing is that wonderful, wonderful man. So I became aware of Indian music through the Beatles, and and then I got a large record collection. But I forget what record he played on, but it was an honor to meet him, as it was an honor to meet the Beatles. This guy was the bomb. He was great.
Hello.
Hi.
I've always just played drums, usually very loudly and crazily, and I'm just starting to get into software or drum machines. I'm just wondering, what's your favorite drum machine or non-acoustic?
Right. I have one. A drum corps. It's I forget who make it, but it's got. I have my dongle with me, but I don't even think I have it installed. I forget who it's. Some company in California, but they sampled the greatest session musicians, like Alan White. They sampled his whole kit, and he put down some loops too. And you could put the whole drum kit through 12 discrete outputs if you want. You can put them each on a different track and rebalance them. And they are recorded pristine audio quality. It's stereo microphones. Every sample is a stereo sample. And I use that like writing, but I actually ended up doing a whole album using various drummers. They have I forget his name, Lonnie something from he's a Motown drummer. So you have all his grooves as well as his drum kit. If you want to do some Motown tracks, you use Lonnie. There's a very low in the Latin American department. There's only one Latin American player, and I wish there were more players and more samples of instruments like the cuica and congos and timbales. There's not enough of that in this. But drum corps, it's called. It's not a very expensive program, and they keep releasing every year. They might add another drummer, so you buy the drummer pack, and like right now, I think it's up to about 20 drummers, 20 different drummers, including some slamming people from Seattle. You have those really very big smashing drum sounds from there to very lightweight sounds with jazz with brushes. So I highly recommend this program.
Wow. There couldn't have been a better answer for that, I don't think. Thank you.
Any more questions? Please join me in showing your big gratitude and thanks to Mr. Tony Visconti.